These are the questions you and I have to ask. How did we get this mine?
OPEC production minutes, helping to drive down the price of oil from $20.50 a barrel in the opening days of 1990 to a mere $13.60 a barrel by summer.
We didn't come over on the Nina, the Pinta, and the whatchamacallit. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Landed right on top of us. Where's the outcry? Why? You can get all the film and the footage of all the carnage in Los Angeles, but you can show me no footage of any damage in Iraq. And all you show me is some surgical strike. Now, 1 year later, it comes out that these so-called surgical strikes were mixed in.
August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein's forces crashed through the defences of oil-rich Kuwait. In fear of an Iraqi invasion into Saudi Arabia, the United States and her coalition allies poured into the Arabian Peninsula to form a deterrent that would be known as Desert Shield. The result was a series of diplomatic talks, negotiations and counter-negotiations that rapidly declined into a no-hope situation. On August the 17th, 1991, Desert Shield became Desert Storm.
Center of this city. Just one comment. Clearly I've never been there, but it feels like we're in the center of hell. There continue to be these flashes of light also. Whoa! Holy cow!
The conflict was witnessed by millions through the eye of CNN and the BBC, showing propaganda of the systematic eradication of Saddam's forces by a coalition far superior in technological, political and economic power. However, what was little known was that from the outset the war was engineered, controlled and manipulated by an elite group. A group which had created the illusion of a man with power at the head of a million-strong army on the verge of going nuclear. A man who had gained control over 1/5 of the world's oil overnight. However, in reality, he was merely a pawn, in amongst many pawns. Just a puppet in a grand master plan, with the Gulf War as a well-orchestrated stepping stone. The orchestrators of the war were by no means strangers to controlling major world events. In fact, they have done so for centuries. From the shadows, they have engineered every major war, revolution and recession. They control everything you read, everything you hear, and everything you see. They have managed to indoctrinate an entire populace to their way of thinking, and have infiltrated key positions in places of authority. And it is from the shadows that they have created a new political order, a new economic order, and more sinister, a new religious order. Their ultimate aim is total global domination, and they will stop at nothing to reach their goal. The goal that was outlined in a speech given by former President of the United States, George Bush.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
However, the origins of this global plan were not created in the offices of the White House. In reality, their roots lay in another war. This time, the year is 1095, and the place, Clermont, France. 11th century Europe was ruled by the Church, which held a firm grip on the hearts and minds of the people. This power enabled Pope Urban II to wage war on the Muslim Caliphate and crusade in what he called a War of the Cross, to recapture the land of Jerusalem. It had been under Muslim rule since the year 637, but in 1099 this rule was brought to a bloody and sudden end. In the name of the cross, women were raped and murdered, children were put to the sword, and it is said that blood ran in the streets knee-high to the horses. Out of this land of bloodshed and terror, a group of men arose. Men that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, no matter what the cost. 20 years after Jerusalem was taken, the Dome of the Rock was seized by a group of warrior monks calling themselves the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, or more simply, the Knights Templars. In Jerusalem, the Templars began to deviate further and further away from the practices of Christianity. They learnt the secret arts of the Kabbalah, an ancient form of Jewish magic, along with its dark rites and rituals. The Jews had learnt the arts from the pagans of ancient Egypt during the times of enslavement to the Pharaoh, and developed them into Babylon at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. In 1307, King Philip of France arrested them for charges of denial of Christ, homosexuality, and idol worship, as well as magic. In 1314, Pope Clement V declared all Templars as heretics to Christianity, ordering all their properties to be seized. Their leader, Jacques de Molay, was captured and burnt to the stake. The Templars were cornered, and just when it seemed they were finished forever, a glimmer of hope arose from a seemingly certain end. They were to find a safe haven as well as an ally. But not in France. In fact, in a country in a desperate struggle for independence against the English. The country of Scotland. For some, Scotland's hope of independence had died with the death of William Wallace. However, to the King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce, the arrival of the Templars gave him a new secret weapon. Their experience, gained over 200 years of fighting the mighty armies of Islam, had made them expert in combat and warfare, and more than a match for any army brought before them. In 1314, the Templars, allied with Robert the Bruce and his army, took to the fields of Bannockburn in the long-awaited showdown with the English. Robert the Bruce's foresight paid off. The 25,000-strong English army suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of only 6,500 men. The dream of an independent Scotland had finally been achieved. The Templars had brought themselves back from the brink of destruction, and never again would they allow themselves to be destroyed. This time, they would control the country by controlling its kings, and in order to preserve their secret order, the Templars would have to die. Or more precisely, the name would have to die. The Templars, who had escaped Europe, were finally laid to rest in Rosslyn Chapel, Scotland, which stands to this day as sign of their presence in Britain. Their descendants became the true power of Scotland. In 1603, the death of Queen Elizabeth I left England without an heir to the throne. By virtue of descent, King James V of Scotland became King of England. In doing so, Scotland and England joined to form a new kingdom, and the power that the Templars held over Scotland spread to give them a firm grip on the whole of Great Britain. For over 100 years, the Templars concealed their activities, fading into the background until they were little known and little remembered. However, they did not cease to keep a firm grip on Britain. All the time they were planning, regrouping, and infiltrating positions of power in all corners of the kingdom. In 1717, the Templars made their reappearance in Europe. They had grown in both number and strength, and were now ready to coin a new identity, free from their reputation of the past, and given credibility by none other than the monarchy and aristocracy of England. And the name they chose for themselves was a name that would be known by many, but understood by a few. This new name, the Freemasons. New identity and the grandeur of its members afforded the Masons with respect and dignity. The first royal member of the Freemasons was Frederick, Prince of Wales. The latest members include Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and consort to the current Queen of England, Elizabeth II, who herself is a grand patron to the Masons. However, behind closed doors, the Freemasons were free to indulge in the secret rites and rituals handed down to them by their ancestors, and these became the basis of their levels of membership, called degrees. The Freemasons were not content with power in Britain alone. Their ambitions were far greater. In the years to come, the world would witness Europe and America being plagued by wars and revolutions, each more devastating than the other. However, these would not be as commonly believed, the spontaneous effects of a downtrodden people, but in fact schemes created by the exclusive few driven by hunger for absolute power. All this would take place from the very country from which they had fled centuries earlier, and would come to the base for their global domination. In 18th century France, The majority of the population was very poor, whilst the aristocracy and royalty lived a life of luxury and extravagance. There existed a wide gulf between the two classes. The Freemasons would use this to make the pledge for power, resulting in the biggest upheaval in French history. The Masons took advantage of the growing atmosphere of anger amongst the French and used it to achieve their own aims with a carefully planned propaganda war. They completely controlled the media system and used it to sway the tide of public opinion. The newspapers were geared into calling for the end of the monarchy and the establishment of a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Masons' vast amounts of wealth were used to influence the political landscape of France. Politicians funded by the Masons promoted the Masonic ideology. The secret lodges of the Masons were open to members of the French army. High-ranking officers and generals were indoctrinated to the Freemasons' way of thinking. With the people, the politicians, and the military of France under Masonic control, the Masons could finally strike. On the 14th of July, 1789, a group of people stormed the Bastille, a prison in Paris. This sign of resistance against the French authorities triggered off a massive response all over France. People in villages and towns expressed their hatred for the system, symbolized by the monarchy. But it was not until 1793 that the French anger would be cooled. On the 21st of January of the same year, King Louis XVI was beheaded in front of a crowd, heralding an end to the French monarchy and paving the way for another Masonic-controlled state in Europe. With the monarchy gone, it seemed as if nothing stood between the Masons and complete control of France. However, what took place would leave the Freemasons in a serious dilemma, and what was to come next was not exactly in accordance with the Masonic plan. A young soldier by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte was about to lead France into a bloody war with Europe, and instead of dancing to the Masonic tune, Napoleon declared himself the Emperor of France. Napoleon was forced to abdicate from his throne in 1814 and was exiled to the island of Corsica. However, in 1815, Napoleon arrived in Paris again, raising a new army ready for a fresh war in Europe. The Masons had a big problem on their hands. Britain and her Masonic allies could not afford to maintain a long-term war against Napoleon without risking bankruptcy. Help came from an unlikely source. Nathan Rothschild was the head of a leading banking family, but because of their status as Jews, they were forced to work from the shadows of others. Rothschild seized the opportunity to liberate his people and offered a loan, demanding in return recognition of the Jews as equals to their European counterparts and the right to openly do business. If the Masons refused, the money could always go to Napoleon. The Masons had no choice but to accept. In 1815, British, Dutch and Prussian soldiers landed in Waterloo, Belgium, where they met Napoleon's forces and defeated them. Napoleon was captured this time, never to return. France was finally under Masonic control. Although historians make little mention of the Masonic involvement in the revolution, the Masons themselves have to reveal their shadowy movements during this important period in history. In 1904, Marquis de Rochambeau, a Freemason, said before a packed audience, "Freemasonry has worked in a hidden but constant manner to prepare the revolution. We are then in complete agreement that Freemasonry was the only author of the revolution, and the applause which I receive from the left, and to which I am little accustomed, proves, gentlemen, that you acknowledge with me that it was Masonry which made the French Revolution." When the so-called founding fathers of America landed on Plymouth Rock, not only did they bring with them disfranchised people, they also brought the Freemasonic elements of Europe. The injustices which the fathers of America were escaping from in Europe was also to be found in the new land, in the form of a tyrannical British regime. In order to gain complete dominance of the new state, the Masons used the same methods to gain control of France. Although the British monarchy was run by the Masons, the American War of Independence was a necessary action, and the people involved in the war were expendable for the Masons to fulfill their dream. The emotions of the people were manipulated into anger, and just like France, anger turned into war. This time, however, previous mistakes would not be repeated. The near defeat the Masons faced against Napoleon and his army in Europe taught the Masons a lesson. Any forthcoming leaders of the resistance must follow the Masonic agenda. The best way to do this was to ensure the leader himself was a Mason, and the leader who took the war to the British was none other than George Washington. On the 4th of July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was made. On the 17th of October 1781, the British were finally defeated and surrendered the colonies to the Americans, and the world's first Masonic state was born, a nation that would represent Masonry in every way. A sign of the Masonic presence in America is plainly visible on the dollar bill, which carries a picture of George Washington, the first Freemasonic president in the world, and a picture of the Freemasonic symbol of the so-called all-seeing one eye. Historically, the control and manipulation of political opinion has been the Freemasons' main weapon in gaining control of countries and states. Once in control of the rulers and politicians of a country, laws and political structures could be changed in accordance with their agenda. However, since restricting the body does not necessarily mean restricting the mind, the Freemason recognizes that their plan for a global government hinges completely on subduing the masses to their agenda, and thus eliminating opposition to their cause. And the greatest threat to their plan, posing more danger than any army or law, is the threat of a free-thinking mind. In order to eliminate this threat and to achieve their objective, the Masons have set about the boldest plan ever devised: the complete control of every aspect of human life, your life. And the weapons they are using against you are in your very homes, entertaining you and your children, and gradually indoctrinating you without you even realizing. In today's society, people are spending more and more time engaged with modern media. Television, cinema, computer games, the internet, popular fiction and popular music are an integral part of our lives. Yet these provide a vast expanse on information which you are taking either consciously or subconsciously into your mind. Information on society ranging from ideals and morals and the difference between right and wrong to the way societies and economies should be structured is passed before you every single day. These media play a significant role in providing the basis for determining an individual's view of the world and everything that exists. Thus, any one group in complete control of this information placed on these media will in effect have the power to indoctrinate practically the entire populace of the world to their way of thinking, and it is this fact the Freemasons are exploiting. The Masons are using the entertainment industry in particular to condition people to their way of thinking, either openly or subliminally. The methods they use vary, but the goal is the same: to impose their beliefs, their ideology and their objectives on you in such a way that you begin to think of them as your own. Evidence of their presence within popular entertainment is widespread. Masonic involvement in the industry is not a new thing. Hailed as one of history's great composers, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a Freemason himself, composed a symphony, which was an open display of Freemasonry. The symphony is based on a story taken from Egyptian mythology of Isis and Osiris. The pagan rites of ancient Egyptian mythology form, through the Kabbalah, one of the fundamental aspects of Freemasonry. It is from these same pagan origins of Egypt that the symbol of the one eye stems. The entire entertainment world is rife with evidence of the Freemasons' presence. Openly or subliminally, their agenda and beliefs and ideals are propagated from big... The entire entertainment world is rife with evidence of the Freemasons' presence. Openly or subliminally, their agenda and beliefs and ideals are propagated from big films to simple cartoons. The Masons have not left anything to chance in promoting their message of a global government. Matt Groening, the creator of one of the most popular cartoon series in television history, The Simpsons, is a self-confessed anarchist. Matt Groening himself has openly declared that he wanted to get his own political ideas across within his work. But he wanted to do this in such a way that people would find it easy to accept his ideas. And the means he chose to this was a clever little cartoon called The Simpsons. So what exactly is The Simpsons teaching us and our children? There are many lessons being programmed into us. These include disregard for authority, either parental and governmental, that bad manners and disobedience is the way to attain status amongst people, and that ignorance is trendy and cool, whereas knowledge is unfashionable. However, what is especially worrying is the Masonic undertones of one episode in particular. The episode in which the father figure of the family, Homer Simpson, becomes obsessed with a group called the Stonecutters, or should it be called the Freemasons? Upon joining the group, his fellow members find a birthmark on him, a mark that makes the rest of the group declare him to be the chosen one.
Ah, the chosen one, whom the sacred parchment prophesied would lead us to glory.
But with his newfound honor and dignity, he, Homer Simpson, fools himself into thinking that he is God.
I always wondered if there was a God, and now I know there is, and it's me.
Some may dismiss it as nothing more than a children's cartoon, a bit of harmless fun. But the influence it has on audience makes it a very effective means of propaganda, indoctrinating a people without them even realizing. Its very creators admit that they are propagating their political ideas to the audience in a covert manner. Ideas spread through the domestic television can reach a far wider audience than movies and cinema. And it is through this media that a new concept is being introduced. The concept of one global leader. Famous for his novel The Jungle Book, Rudyard Kipling, another Freemason, wrote a book called The Man Who Would One Day Be King. This was later made into a big-budget Hollywood film, starring the likes of Sean Connery, Michael Caine, and Saeed Jaffari. The book is the story of two soldiers that journey to a country on the edge of India, a country that was once rumored to contain great riches, that once belonged to Alexander the Great. Upon reaching the country, the two soldiers are captured by the local inhabitants, a people called Kafirs, named after their country, Kafiristan. When the two men are about to be killed, a necklace is discovered around the neck of one of the soldiers. Engraved on it is the symbol of the Masonic one eye. The Kafirs revere him as their god and attribute to him the divine attribute of immortality. The man himself first regards himself as a king, and then in his newfound power begins to regard himself really as being a god. From the Muslim perspective, if not that of others, the similitudes that can be drawn from this story are very interesting. The Muslim scriptures, called Hadith, contain many prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad. In these, it is prophesied that a man would arise from amidst the Kafirs, which means infidels in Islam, who would be recognized by his one eye and would be made a world leader, claiming first to be a king and then later to being God, and that he will seem immortal until an appointed time. In another film, the concept of global leader and global government is also strongly propagated. In 1996, the film Independence Day broke all box office records, becoming the 7th highest ranking film of all time. It entranced audiences around the world with a fictional story of an alien invasion on Earth. However, deep within the film's subliminal messages can be found, indicating the Freemasonic presence and the Freemasonic agenda. In the film, there is a military base known as Area 51. It is from here that the military offensive is launched, on which the salvation of the whole world and the future of its inhabitants depends. The entrance to this installation is a pyramid, on which is engraved the symbol of the one eye. The film shows the USA as the forerunner in establishing a global offensive, involving all the nations of the world, an offensive which is devised, controlled and commanded by one man, one overall leader. The film is part of an upsurge in an upsurge of films and television serials on the topics of aliens, UFOs, and invasions threatening the whole of mankind. These are gradually fueling the growing interest and public unrest on the issue. This is just one of the many ways in which the Freemasons are paving the way for their global government. The Freemasons are using a number of approaches to drive fear into the hearts of the masses.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
Other tactics that the Masons are using in order to bring about a one-world government and the need for a global security force controlled by them is to allow crime rates to soar, thus creating fear for personal and national security. The drugs industry, according to official estimates, is in terms of monetary value one of the largest industries in the world. The countries of the world are currently involved in trying to solve this problem on a national and international scale. The United States, for example, has a huge and growing drugs problem, the direct result of which has been soaring crime rates, which continue to increase at an alarming rate. Backed by the growing levels of public demand for tougher action, the government has justification to use heavy-handed, overt and covert operations to combat the drugs problem and satisfy public opinion. However, certain disturbing facts about the American drugs war throw a shadow of doubt upon its credibility and the motives of the government. It is commonly believed that during the 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover, the then chairman of the FBI, allowed the drugs trade to flourish within the African American community in an attempt to undermine the black community's uprising within American society. During the 1980s, with the threat of communism taking over Central America, money was urgently required to finance the rebellion movement against communism. And to raise this, the CIA allowed drugs to be traded into America. Revelations by the American Senator, Jack Bloom, who was part of an investigatory committee into the matter, confirms this. The pathetic justification given by the FBI for using drugs to subdue the African American community in the 1960s was that the black uprising was in actual fact a communist attempt to undermine America's involvement in Vietnam. During the Contra Wars in the 1980s, the scapegoats used to justify the flow of drugs into America were once again the communists. However, today the threat of communism no longer exists, yet the drugs trade is still flourishing in America, and the trade in international drugs trafficking is soaring, raising the question as to why.
In the course of the Contra War, the United States, as a matter of policy, abandoned drug law enforcement, looked the other way at the kinds of conditions we were creating that enhanced the ability of traffickers to move dope into the United States, and in effect allowed a drug trade to flourish, all to support the Contra movement and to support the war.
Historically, the Freemasons have used or created problems within society to turn and manipulate events in accordance with their agenda. The rising drugs problem in America gives the authorities of all the justification needed to use stronger, heavy-handed tactics on an even wider scale. Already major transatlantic operations, as well as American and Latin American operations, have been undertaken to combat the drugs epidemic. It will not be long before there is significant backing for a strong global offensive. Distortion of the facts and usage of manufactured and biased statistics are the tools of the Freemasonic governments of today, as well as creating a public need for greater national and global security. Rising rates of crime, drug abuse, and the increasing threat of terrorism act to serve the purpose of promoting greater control of the masses. Control of the masses means the complete control of every aspect of human life. Shocking acts of terrorism, soaring crime rates, and increasing incidences of violence are propounded by film, media, and government reports alike, create strong public sympathy and support for harsh tactics and surveillance techniques, until individuals are monitored to a level more befitting a totalitarian state. Public opinion will once again be manipulated to give the Masons justification for their actions and make their goals easier. The means of monitoring the masses and storing all personal information on individuals in society on a massive mega database are already underway. Rapid movements are taking place towards storing personal information on individuals on plastic, such as banking details, driving license information, and national insurance details. Currently, these details are stored on separate cards, but plans are well underway to merge all the information onto one identity card. The consequence would be complete monitoring of all purchases and transactions and personal details of an individual at the touch of a button. In 1992, the Vice-Chancellor of the British Supreme Court, Nicholas Brown Wilkinson, told the High Court that if the information obtained by the police, the Inland Revenue, the social services, the health service and other agencies were to be gathered together in one file, the freedom of the individual would be greatly at risk. The Freemasons, through the governments controlled by them, already have access to a vast array of information about you. They can already find out who you talk to on the phone, where you work, where you shop, what you eat, what you wear, how much you are worth, what you earn, and the list goes on and on. One identity card would allow even closer monitoring and enable a complete psychological profile to be compiled on every individual in society. Information which would make it very easy to predict, control, and manipulate actions. However, there is a gap that the Masons need to fill in. By using hard currency, an individual can evade detection and vital information is lost since hard currency transactions are untraceable. As a result, moves are being made to replace hard currency with a system that relies totally on electronic funds transfer. In other words, a system that relies totally on cards. Trails in Swindon have heralded the first signs of a move towards the introduction of smart cards and electronic money on a national scale in the UK. The Mondex scheme is pioneered by NatWest and Midland Banks and British Telecom. Inside a smart card is a microchip which calculates every single transaction, not only financial transactions, but records every single thing for which it is used. It can serve as a credit card, a building society passbook, library card, travel card, phone card, and quite possibly an identity card. Although an identity card would reveal much detail, it would not be able to locate any one person precisely at any given instant time. This would require some sort of tracking device that could be put on and detected wherever that person may be on the globe. The tracking device would be an all-purpose microchipped identification device or an electronic implant placed under the skin. These implants could then send off a signal which could then be picked up by satellite in low Earth orbit, locating and identifying the subject. Although this may sound like the works of fiction, it is, however, already well on its way to becoming reality. There are already approximately 48 global positioning satellites in orbit that are in use by the United States and her allies. These satellites can act upon incoming signals and pass down accurate information to the source of the signal about its location. At present, the source of the signals are devices that are attached to tanks, battleships, aircraft, or handheld instruments for accurate navigation purposes. The next step would be to introduce the device that creates the source signal on every individual. Currently, one form of device that has been created specifically as a signal source for the satellites is the electronic tag. Already a scheme using such tags on individuals is in operation in the UK. The justification used is that it is necessary to curb the growth in the population of the already overflowing prisons. The tag fits securely around the offender's wrists and can be monitored to see if the offenders are violating curfew regulations. Pilot tagging schemes are already in operation in Greater Manchester, Berkshire and Norfolk, with plans for expansion in other countries in the coming year. The Freemasons' plan for complete global control by one governmental body means that they must pave the way for complete global economic union, complete global legislatory and political union, and complete global military union. On March the 25th, 1957, with the creation of the European Economic Community, the first significant steps in the creation of this global government were taken. Since then, the EEC has become a testing ground for the New World Order. With the basic tenets of freedom of movement between member states already established, goods and people can move relatively freely within this one superstate. The plans are already underway for the establishment of complete monetary union, and the powers of the governmental body of Europe are growing every day, paving the way for complete political and legislatory union. All this will mean that eventually, in the superstate of the European Economic Community, there will be one currency, one economy, and one government. And the government would most certainly be a Masonic government. The three most important players of the European community are Britain, France, and Germany. Britain and France have long been Masonically controlled nations. During World War II, Germany was completely annexed by Britain and France, along with the United States, another Masonic nation, and the Soviet Union. The sectors of Germany controlled by the former three countries, the Masonic nations, formed a separate political identity called West Germany. And with the downfall of the Berlin Wall, West Germany has now taken over the former East Germany. Europe is not alone in its efforts to achieve superstate status. America and Mexico are currently the only two members of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. However, the nations of the South are increasingly being pursued to join. With Masonic superstates in both Europe and America firmly established, global union would be a logical and easy progression. However, there is another problem that the Masons need to contend with if they are to be the masters of this global union. By the 1970s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the population of Europe and white America was rapidly declining. Unless something was done, the expanding size of the population of third world nations would pose a serious threat to national security of Masonically controlled countries. Western consumer power and productivity would reduce, and as a result, they would be completely dependent on that of the third world population. Somehow the gap between Western population and third world population had to be a bridge to restore Western supremacy, or more precisely, Masonic supremacy, at a global scale. In the 1970s, President Jimmy Carter commissioned the Global 2000 report. The findings of the report blamed virtually all of the world problems on the population growth of non-white people. The report went on as far as recommending the elimination of at least 2 billion people in third world nations off the face of the earth by the year 2000 in order to restore Western supremacy. Interestingly enough, also in the 70s, the AIDS epidemic broke out, claiming huge amounts of life in third world nations, as well as amongst the growing black and Hispanic population of America. It was said that the virus originated from green monkeys in Africa and was later passed on to the local population through either acts of bestiality or through consuming them as food. From there on, AIDS spread like wildfire across the African continent and later on to the rest of the world, claiming millions of lives. However, the story was just a smokescreen. On June 2nd, 1988, the Los Angeles Times published an article refuting the idea that the human AIDS virus originated from green monkeys. It uncovered evidence that the DNA composition of AIDS was totally inconsistent with that of green monkeys. In fact, it could be proven that the AIDS virus could not be found anywhere in nature and could only have ever survived in the human biological system. If the virus did not exist anywhere in nature, the question is raised as to where exactly the virus all of a sudden stemmed from. On July the 4th, 1984, the New Delhi newspaper in India called The Patriot published an article making the first detailed charges of AIDS as being a counter-biological warfare agent. An anonymous American anthropologist was quoted claiming that AIDS was genetically engineered at the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Laboratory at Fort Detrick near Frederick, Maryland. Then on October the 30th, 1985, the Soviet journal Literaturia Gazeta repeated the charges made by the Indian newspaper, making it an international controversy. All this, however, was easily passed off as a communist rhetoric by the Masonic West. However, on October the 26th, 1986, the Sunday Express became the first Western newspaper to run a front-page story confirming the findings of the Indian and Soviet newspapers entitled AIDS Made in Lab Shop. The outbreak of AIDS has been linked to vaccine programs around the world. The internationally respected London Times newspaper published an article at the front-page story on May the 11th, 1987 entitled Smallpox Vaccine Triggered AIDS. The article establishes a direct correlation between the smallpox vaccine administered by the World Health Organization to an estimated 50 to 70 million people in different Central African countries and the subsequent outbreaks of AIDS in those regions. The World Health Organization is the medical wing of the United Nations. The evidence suggests that AIDS is a genetically engineered virus spread through vaccination programs in third world countries, germ warfare against the innocent and the weak, aimed at eliminating an entire populace off the face of the earth. AIDS is nothing other than the modern-day final solution, and all of this for the purpose of installing an economic policy that would give complete global domination to the Masonic West. However, for the Freemasons' economic domination on its own is not enough. In order to have Masonic governments at the head of global union, under complete Masonic control, an economic union may suffice, but to keep it there, they would need a military union, and that union would be none other than the UN. The United Nations is a general assembly of the majority of the nations of the world. Britain, France and America are already ranked within the 5 major powers of its Security Council, with the others being Russia and China. This means they have enough power to veto any motions passed. In December 1992, the President of the General Assembly declared that the UN must become a functional world parliament, and went on to say that the UN should be equipped with its own intelligence service. However, the UN has already attained military power. It operates its own army, an army that stood back while thousands of Muslims were killed by the Serbs in Bosnia, and instead implement an arms embargo that left the Muslims without any means of self-defense. When UN soldiers were sent to wage war against General Mohammed Farah Aidid during the months between June and October 1993, American helicopters fired on hospitals, houses and civilian crowds, killing hundreds of unarmed people. After an attack in which 71 died, the head of the UN mission, Admiral Jonathan Howe, said, "We knew what we were hitting. It was well planned." This was a clear breach of the Geneva Convention, but when the US military attorney was confronted on these points, his reply was that the Geneva Convention did not apply to the UN forces on the technicality that the UN is not the signatory to the convention. In other words, UN troops were free to commit any war crimes or atrocities they wanted and were above any law. In fact, the UN, far from bringing peace with it as it claims, instead has spread corruption in the land, leaving a trail of death and destruction wherever it has gone. Days of the Cold War, the very existence of the Soviet Union meant that the Freemasons' path to a global government would take time. Now that communism has been destroyed, it seems that the Freemasons can at last use the UN to achieve their goals of a global government, therefore having the entire world at their grasp with none to stand in their way, or so they thought. For as the earth cries out because of the corruption and injustice they have spread over the land, through the agonizing centuries of their domination, the world is witnessing the reawakening of an old warrior. Now, the Freemasons have another enemy to contend with, an enemy which they have thought that they have destroyed, an enemy that will never bow down to the evil and demonic plan of the Freemasons. That enemy is Islam, and against it they have declared war. However, the Muslims have already been forewarned about an enemy that will face them, the last prophet of God. Muhammad said that a man will appear after the Muslims have conquered a Roman city called Constantinople. He will first appear as a tyrannical king, then he will be claimed to be a prophet, and finally he will claim to be the Lord God himself. Already the first part of the prophecy has been fulfilled. Constantinople was conquered and renamed Istanbul. The prophet further foretold that this liar would start to conquer the world, country by country, fortress by fortress, region by region, town by town, and no place will remain unscathed except the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He will possess powers to issue a command to the sky, and it will rain, and to the earth, and it will produce crops. He will call to a false religion, and bring something which resembles paradise and hell. But that which resembles paradise will in fact be hell, and that which resembles hell will in fact be paradise. He is the Dajal, meaning imposter, and he will be born with one eye, and your Lord is not one-eyed. It is also known that before the appearance of the Dajjal, a group of people will pave the way, setting up a system to prepare the world for his arrival. In other words, these forerunner to the Dajjal and their system will bear all the characteristics of the Dajjal, and he will be the final embodiment of these in human form. The forerunners to the Dajjal are none other than the Freemasons. The one eye is one of the ways to recognize the Dajjal. The one eye is the symbol of the Freemasons. It is part of their beliefs and is taken from ancient Egyptian mythology. In their ideology, it represents the supreme being, sometimes referred to as the great architect of the universe. The scholars of Islam say that the similitude of the Dajjal is that of the Pharaoh who tarried with the prophet Moses. The Pharaoh was a tyrannical leader who elevated himself in status and declared himself to be God. He used magicians to create illusions and fool the people, and oppressed all who did not conform to his false religion. Today the Freemasons weave another kind of magic. The illusions they create take the form of hidden or openly propagated messages in films, televisions, cartoons, music, and all the other cogs in their well-oiled media machine. And this same media machine has continuously been put into action to slander and destroy the character of Islam, following another trait of the Dajjal, who goes further and slanders God directly. The Dajjal is an oppressor to all who do not follow him. He will have powers to increase the land harvest or destroy it, depending whether the people follow him. Similarly, the Freemasonic West, through the World Bank, hold the third world nations to ransom if they do not act in accordance with their wishes. Abundance of IMF development loans are often used to ensnare such nations, and the unattainable interest payments keep them ensnared. They are forced to submit or face economic collapse and dire poverty. Another way in which the Dajjal will control the people, either deluding them or forcing them to submit, is by spreading disease. He will have the ability to spread disease or cure it, effectively playing God, and with this power, he will delude many to his false religion. The Freemasons also play with people's lives in this manner. Evidence exists showing that many viruses have created or mutated in military labs and later used in experiments on human beings. And it has been established that AIDS is a man-made tool used to suit the purposes of Masonic West. The Dajjal shall try to strip God of all of his divine attributes and claim them for himself. This arrogance is also the way of the Freemasons, who are engaged in replacing the laws of God with those that are man-made and claiming justice across the land, using technology to monitor all that you do, trying to see and hear everything, using genetics to alter and to improve the creation to reach their false standards. Their arrogance knows no bounds, and they obey no law but that of their own making. These are the forerunners to the Dajjal. These are the Freemasons. Prophet Muhammad said that a time would come when the whole world would gather around to plan the destruction of the Muslims, as if they were gathered around a table to take part in a meal. Today the nations of the world are doing just that, around the circular tables of the United Nations General Assembly Hall. He also said that the time of the Dajjal will be years of confusion. People will believe a liar and disbelieve one who is trustworthy, and those who rebel against God will have a say in general affairs. Today, during the time preceding the Dajjal, there is also a time of confusion. The system set up by the forerunners to the Dajjal have ensnared many Muslims away from truth, using lures such as wealth and materialism and fulfillment of earthly desires. A miserable trade indeed. These times of tribulation are like a giant sieve, sorting out the true believers from the apostates and hypocrites. Many have adopted the lifestyle and philosophy of the Dajjal system, retaining perhaps only their Muslim names or clothing, wearing them like a badge to their identity, and in every other way embracing wholeheartedly the system that is being used to eradicate Islam. Embracing the same system that stood back and did nothing when pregnant Muslim women had their bellies ripped open by Serbs, killing them and the contents of their wombs. The same system that stands still whilst women and small girls are being raped in Kashmir. A system that stood still whilst mothers saw their children dragged away by soldiers during the night, never to return, simply because they spoke out against being refugees in their own homeland. And the same system that said nothing to the tyrant, that gassed women and children simply because he danced the Masonic tune. For those who choose this system, claim to love Allah and his messenger, but hate what he has brought, leave the guidance that is Islam, and they adhere to the evil system of the Dajjal, living their lives in accordance with its rules, and seeking from it worldly rewards, disregarding the truth that is the laws of Allah. They are those who invite upon themselves the wrath of Allah.
They came down to the side of the road by the thousands. And they had Kuwaiti flags, and some had American flags.
The forerunners to the Dajjal have set up this system to destroy Islam, either directly, through military and economic coercion, or indirectly, using ideological warfare. They have divided and conquered, instilling diseases such as nationalism and racism into the heart of the Ummah. Their biggest fear is Muslim unity and revival of the message brought by the last prophet to mankind. and everything they do is geared to prevent this. They have manipulated Muslims, setting up and promoting divides. They have installed their own universal language, compelling all to learn or be shut out, and reducing Arabic to secondary and inferior language in society. And what they have used most to keep the Muslims at bay is oil. During World War I, the Freemasonic governments managed to destroy the Islamic Caliphate and annexed all its territories. The part now called Iraq was put to British mandate, and current borders were defined by them and through the Iran-Iraq War. After its independence, the USA took over interest in Iraq. In fear of a purist Islamic uprising, the CIA aided the Ba'ath Party's rise to power, making Saddam Hussein the leader of Iraq and an ally to the Masonic states. When Kuwait later started raising its oil prices, it was destroying the war-torn economy of Iraq. Threats were made but ignored. The situation worsened until finally Iraqi troops were mobilized to the border. The Freemasonic media, the American media in particular, portrayed this as a shock and outrage. However, it is reported that the US ambassador to Kuwait had prior knowledge of the invasion and Iraq's intentions, as did the CIA. After the Gulf War, Saddam is still alive, and Kuwait has been liberated. It remains to be asked exactly what purpose the Gulf War served to its Freemasonic orchestrators. The Masonic West has long realized that the control of oil is vital to their economies. One of the main reasons is their reliance on cars and road transport. However, although technology exists to mass-produce fully operational electric cars, all attempts to do so have been vetoed. This is because oil is crucial to maintaining their world order. Without the wealth from oil, Muslim economies would fall. And without the puppet governments and leaders, such as Saddam Hussein, the Freemasonic West could not control the Muslim nations. Without the division of wealth and false leadership of these nations, nothing would prevent the purist Islamic movements from coming to power. Poverty creates unity, and Muslim unity is the greatest fear of the forerunners to the Dajal. The Gulf Wars served many purposes: to promote Western unity, to create divides amongst the Muslim nations, to act as a testing ground for an entire arsenal of military weapons and cocktails of chemicals and drugs. But most of all, it served to ensure a strong military presence in the Middle East. The Dajjal has placed a strong hold in the very heart of Islam itself and laid a firm grip on the Muslim holy lands. But although they plan, Allah also plans, and Allah is the best of planners. The final victory will be with the Muslims.
Make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water. The enemy of freedom has chosen to make this year.
It is a big idea, a new world order.
I see America through the eyes of a victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. Where's the outcry? Why? You can get all the film and the footage of all the carnage in Los Angeles, but you can show me no footage of any damage in Iraq. And all you show me is some surgical fight. Now, 1 year later, it comes out that these
as Martin Luther King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. Until we disarm and de-escalate our war machine, we're going to be hated around the world.
There lies an organization which acts above the law, an organization that acts without conscience, without morals, without regrets. A group who follow only a dark and untouchable ideology. Black helicopters and black ops are real. An organization above the law without a god and without a conscience do exist. There is no price too high and no casualties too great. A cold, rogue organization that has risen up independent of the people, independent of government.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
It was not until 1941, when motivated by Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor, that the USA decided that it was time they became part of what was known as the Great Game. When the US entered World War II, they were lacking in vital spy and counter-spy skills. The Russians, British and Germans had been mastering these skills for centuries. The USA was at an obvious disadvantage. The wheels were set in motion, and in 1942 the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was created. General William Donovan, a World War I hero, was selected to head the organization. His determined, jovial personality and his upper-class status set the tone and played a significant role in shaping the actions and attitudes, actions that would later be inherited by the OSS successor. The OSS not only carried out the daily operations of intelligence gathering, but in addition, it was engaged as a concealed weapon for the various resistance and partisan organizations fighting in occupied countries in both Europe and the Far East. The hierarchy of the organization was students of Harvard, Yale, and other Ivy League colleges, sons of the upper class, who could combine exquisite taste, impeccable manners, and brutal ruthlessness. The OSS had developed several assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler. They almost succeeded in their attempts when a bomb plot in 1944 came close to blowing him up at his Wolf's Lair. As Germany collapsed, a race against the Russians for Nazi technology and intelligence began. The OSS, under the codename Operation Paperclip, obtained a number of files and records detailing experiments involving mind control and psychoactive drugs that were conducted on the concentration camp inmates. They also obtained key surviving Nazi personnel such as Joseph Mengele, the doctor in charge of human experiments. Mengele and other war criminals were quietly relocated to Canada. General Reinhard Gehlen was the head of Hitler's intelligence. When Germany's defeat was imminent, Gehlen predicted that the future conflict would be waged between the two emerging superpowers, America and the Soviet Union. Gehlen, as part of a deal with the American military, agreed to surrender important documents pertaining to the Soviet Union. In addition, as part of that deal, he asked that his organization, the Gehlen Organization, be absorbed into US military intelligence. In 1947, the US Congress passed an act that absorbed the OSS into a new organization called the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was born. The newly found agency had the responsibility of coordinating, evaluating, and disseminating information from other US intelligence organizations. However, written in the fine print of this act was the additional duty of fighting the dark and imminent Cold War against communism. In 1953, the CIA began its full-out war against communism. The Red Threat was equated to Satanism. This threat was declared the enemy of the free world. Such a danger was to be unrelentlessly fought tooth and nail, Every tool in their arsenal was to be used to crush any communist rhetoric.
If our most privileged information about the world has been coming to us, to our policymakers, since 1948 through the CIA, then the worldview that the CIA has presented in the Oval Office is a worldview that basically is founded in a Nazi intelligence organization, the Gehlen organization, which has been there from the beginning, and what we have today is simply the heirs of that original choice.
The policy adapted by the agency was that once you were against communism, nothing else mattered. They therefore had no scruples about hiring the most powerful organized crime families to do their dirty work. The question was asked, how long could a supposedly democratically sanctioned organization go on doing business with thugs, madmen and gangsters without starting to resemble them? The first victim in the CIA's path of destruction was to be Guatemala. In 1952, Guatemalan President Jacob Arbenz signed a land reform law that would ultimately take into state ownership the large number of plantations owned by US fruit companies. Alan Dulles felt that Arbenz might be an inspiration to other countries in Central America. This would undoubtedly lead to a destabilization of US economic interests in these countries. Arbenz had to go. Using leaflets, planted articles, comic books and news stories, the agency spread the alarmist impression that Guatemala was going to become communist at any moment. Rumors were spread of Arbenz's supposed plan to replace the regular army with armed militia and make himself the absolute dictator of the country. The radio station La Voz de Liberación, controlled by the CIA, began broadcasting out of Honduras the false impression that thousands of anti-communist freedom fighters were massing on the border ready to invade. Arbenz, however, never had more than 400 men under his control at any point in time during the revolution. He was now losing the support of his army and air force. On June 2, 1954, a failed attempt was made on Arbenz's life. 2 weeks later, CIA plans went into action, bombing and strafing the major cities, including the capital, Guatemala City. It was at this point that Arbenz, who had previously stood strong, could no longer stand the pressure, and after persuasion from trusted senior officers, Arbenz handed in his resignation. Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, leader of the anti-Arbenz Liberation Army, moved in, and with the support of the agency, took political control. Armas subsequently reversed most of Arbenz's reforms and offered great concessions to foreign investors.
It is clear that this nation, in concert with all the free nations of this hemisphere, must take an ever closer and more realistic look at the menace of external communist intervention and domination.
Next on the CIA's list was Cuba. The attempt to destabilize this country would prove to be the CIA's worst nightmare. Cuba, under the leadership of General Batista, thrived on corruption and bribery. In January 1960, the overthrow of Batista by Fidel Castro and his revolutionary army would mark the turning point for Cuba.
December of 1959, Castro does a major policy speech in Havana, announces he's a communist. Now he's upset not just the American mafia, but now the American government.
A communist country a few hundred miles off the shores of the USA was seen as the ultimate threat. In the interest of American banks and sugar industry, Castro too had to go. However, they underestimated the strength of Cuba. The Cuban army was well prepared to defend their independence with their lives if necessary. The agency soon realized that the removal of Castro would prove more difficult than they initially thought.
It is clear that the forces of communism are not to be underestimated in Cuba or anywhere else in the world. The advantages of a police state, its use of mass terror and arrest to prevent the spread of free dissent, cannot be overlooked. If the self-discipline of the free cannot match the iron discipline of the mailed fist, then the peril of freedom will continue to rise.
It was then that plans were put into place for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Under the guidance of Covert Operations Director Richard Bissell, 1,500 men, backed by full US naval and air support, were to make a D-Day style landing on the beach of Playa Girón on the Bay of Pigs. They were then to join forces with what was believed to be a large anti-Castro underground coalition, recruited by the likes of George Bush, a top CIA official at that time. At the end of 1960, these plans were given the stamp of approval by President John Kennedy. However, after consulting with his brother Bobby Kennedy and other civilian advisors, several flaws were discovered. It was then that Kennedy withdrew his decision and firmly ruled out any direct US troop involvement or large-scale American air support. This order was ignored. Dulles assumed that the new young president would be unable to refuse any needed support in the heat of battle if things went wrong. During the night of April 15, 1961, CIA-piloted bombers destroyed Cuba's minuscule air force. At midnight 2 days later, troops invaded the Bay of Pigs only to run headlong into Castro's tanks. The troops were forced to dig in on the exposed beach and wait for the Navy and Air Force to arrive. It was then that Dulles made the call to Kennedy, insisting that he authorize planes and ships to bail out the stranded troops. Much to his surprise, the president flatly refused, leaving them to defend themselves.
Gallant Cuban refugees must have known that they were chancing, determined as they were against heavy odds, to pursue their courageous attempts to regain their island's freedom. But Cuba is not an island unto itself, and our concern is not ended by mere expressions of non-intervention or regret.
Although Kennedy accepted full responsibility for the fiasco, he felt betrayed and was determined to destroy the agency to prevent it happening again. Over the next few years, the CIA's intent on removing Castro designed several failed attempts on his life, including contaminating his cigars with LSD, a pill containing botulin toxins designed to make him ill, a seashell that would explode and kill him while he was scuba diving, contamination of his wetsuit with a fungus that would give him a deadly skin rash. In October 1963, Kennedy ordered the agency to cease all assassination attempts. He then made efforts with the help of Special Advisor to the US delegation at the UN, William Atwood, to develop closer ties with Cuba. On November 17, 1963, Atwood reported that he had been invited to a meeting in Havana. It was the dawn of new US-Cuban relations. However, this progress was stopped short when 5 days later, President Kennedy was shot in the head in a motorcade through Dallas. The CIA could now, without any revolutionary presidential interruptions, return to creating anti-communist propaganda and sabotage. By 1964, Vietnam had replaced Cuba as the greatest threat to the agency. They were determined to make Vietnam their own personal war. It would be an opportunity to restore some honor to their damaged reputation. It also provided the perfect testbed for weapons that had waited in readiness throughout the Cold War. William Colby led the Phoenix program, the centerpiece of the efforts of the CIA in Vietnam. Colby realized that the Vietnamese War had two fronts: the conventional war that was being fought against the North Vietnamese army, and the sophisticated guerrilla war that was being carried out by the Viet Cong. Project Phoenix was designed to tackle the Viet Cong problem. Operatives would pay as much as $20,000 US for a crucial name or piece of information. Suspected VC and VC sympathizers were to be assassinated by special hunter-killer teams. An estimated 20,000 suspected communist supporters were killed without trial as a result of this program. Among its other covert operations was the use of the supposed-to-be commercial airline Air America to ferry its own operatives, concealed weapons and drugs into Saigon. Unfortunately, Air America in return was transporting raw opium, which after being refined in Thailand, found its way back to Saigon in the form of heroin that went on sale to the US troops in the jungles and rice fields. William Colby, like those before him, had made the vital mistake of underestimating the abilities of the enemy. The Vietnamese had been for almost a millennium fighting off foreign invaders and had by now perfected guerrilla tactics. In the end, the Americans were forced out of Vietnam. The CIA had, however, emerged victorious. Vietnam was the paving ground for some of its most frightening theories and would set the tone for the company's actions in the years to come. Grenada was invaded by the US military in October 1983. America, in response to the assassination of Maurice Bishop, had acted to restore stability by reinstating democracy. Maurice Bishop's PRC party was a pan-socialist one with links to Russia, Cuba, and China. His goal was to implement social reform in the island so that the population would enjoy relative equal opportunities and a good standard of living. Rumors have it that the CIA, with the assistance of Bernard Cord, the insurrection leader, had planned the demise of Maurice Bishop and the PRC. The CIA did not need another communist-aligned nation so close to its borders, and to prevent this, nothing would stand in their way. Manuel Noriega helped the Mexican Air Force control the movement of cocaine from Colombia and Bolivia through Panama and into the US. Noriega's life was threaded through corrupt Panamanian politics since the 1960s. His career of drug trafficking and money laundering profited from the close cooperation with the DEA, who arrested his competitors. Noriega had enjoyed a long stint on the CIA payroll in return for many services, such as helping the covert wars against Salvadoran rebels and his offer of assistance to Oliver North. Noriega's arrogance later became an embarrassment to the Bush administration. Noriega's reign was concluded when George Bush ordered the Operation Just Cause invasion in December 1989, in what was summarized as the most expensive one-man drug bust in history. General Omar Torrijos preceded him, a populist whose rule was ended in a suspicious 1981 plane crash that some believe was CIA arranged. The CIA over the years has been suspected of playing a major role in some of the world's most scandalous executions. The CIA walked away with no probable involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the early 1960s. The former Belgian Congo country had been a vital source of minerals for America and Western Europe. When the Belgians pulled out of their African colony, they left instability and chaos behind. When UN troops failed to contain the army of Lumumba's arch-rival, General Moise Tshombe, Lumumba turned to the USSR for support. This meant that the Soviets would now be able to extend their bloc into Africa. This, as far as the agency was concerned, was an unforgivable offense. To the outside world, it appeared as though Lumumba was betrayed to the Tshombe forces and murdered while in captivity, when in fact he had been conveniently removed by the CIA to prevent Soviet domination in Africa. The CIA walked away with nothing pointing to their involvement in the death of this revolutionary African leader.
I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million black people who are the victims of Americanism. And I see America through the eyes of a victim. I don't see any American dream, I see an American nightmare.
On February the 21st, 1965, as Malcolm X stood to address a meeting in the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, he was shot in the chest with bullets from a sawn-off shotgun. No evidence directly linked the death of the revolutionary Afro-American Muslim leader to the CIA, but suspicions still persist.
The Nation of Islam, by that time, was thoroughly infiltrated. They could not plan a stroll in Central Park. So at the very least, they were aware of plans to assassinate Brother Malcolm, and did nothing to stop it. At worst, they were the puppeteers.
Malcolm's open condemnation of the CIA and US involvement in the Congo made him a target. The day before, he was scheduled to address a summit conference of African prime ministers in Cairo. He collapsed with severe stomach pains after eating a meal at his hotel. He now suspected that the agency was out to get him, but still continued his campaign. As rumors of the agency's intentions spread, Malcolm was refused entry into France. A few days before he was shot, his home in Queens was firebombed, a warning sign of what was to come.
The assassination of Malcolm X was an unfortunate tragedy, and it reveals that there are still numerous people in our nation who have degenerated to the point of expressing dissent through murder, and we haven't learned to disagree without being violently disagreeable.
It was assumed that Malcolm's death was the result of sectarian revenge. The view held by many prominent blacks, however, was that Malcolm's killing was a political act with international implications. Malcolm's successor, Leon Amir, determined to expose the agency, scheduled a press conference during which he was to present evidence pointing to Malcolm's real killers. The next morning, Amir was found dead in Boston's Sherry Biltmore Hotel. The police report stated that he had died of an epileptic fit. Ironically, he had no medical history of epilepsy. Malcolm X had been on the CIA watch list for some time. The timing of the assassination coincided with numerous events, namely his acceptance of Orthodox Islam, and moreover his extension of his initial localized policy to one that would call for global unity of African nations.
The journey was to Mecca to make myself an authentic Muslim and to give us direct link, direct contact, direct communication and cooperation with our brothers and sisters all over the earth. So the first step that has been taken, brothers and sisters, since Garvey died, to actually establish contact with our African brothers on the African continent.
Malcolm X had grown from a local menace to an international voice for the oppressed black man. His power was on the rise, and in a preemptive action, he was silenced.
No Negro leaders have fought for civil rights. They have begged the white man for civil rights. They have begged the white man for freedom. And anytime you beg another man to set you free, you will never be free. Freedom is something that you have to do for yourself. And until the American Negro lets the white man know that we are really, really ready and willing to pay the price that is necessary for freedom, our people will always be walking around here second-class citizens, or what you call 20th century slaves. What price are you talking about, sir? The price of freedom is death.
Another 2 years later, in 1967, Argentinian-born Che Guevara would become one of the agency's major hits. Che with Castro had been a founder of the Cuban Revolution. He had been a thorn in the CIA's side for a long time. After Castro's liberation of Cuba, Che began representing Cuba on many commercial missions. He also was renowned in the West for his opposition to all forms of imperialism and neo-colonialism, and for his attacks on US foreign policy. During the early 1960s, he defined Cuba's policies and his own views in many speeches and writings, notably
El socialismo y el hombre en Cuba.
Che was later involved in the Congo with other Cuban guerrilla fighters, helping to organize the Patrice Lumumba Battalion. At the time, there was no person more feared by the company than Che Guevara. He had the capacity and charisma necessary to direct the struggle against the political repression of the traditional hierarchies of power in the countries of Latin America and Africa. In 1967, the notorious CIA agent Felix Rodriguez captured and assassinated Che while he was organizing a guerrilla group in Bolivia. This assassination, however, backfired globally on the agency. Within days of his death, the charismatic leader had become a world icon, a martyr for the revolution. He would become the poster boy for the 1960s. His image appeared on t-shirts and posters from New York to Tokyo. Even today, his image is still popular.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk. At any time it must be faced.
Oliver Stone's controversial 1991 movie JFK forced the case to be reopened with some chilling findings. The overwhelming bulk of material published about Kennedy would point to three major suspects: the FBI, CIA, and the Mafia. These organizations were the only ones with enough resources and assets to plan and execute the murder of the US president in broad daylight and carry out a cover-up operation that would involve the murder of over 50 people. On its own, the Mafia simply did not have the contacts, clout, and know-how to pull off such an elaborate stunt. They probably acted as backup and helped with some of the cleanup operations. There is also a shadow of doubt about the FBI's active involvement in the murder of Kennedy. FBI directors already had enough evidence of the president's constant womanizing to bring him down without murdering him. The FBI's lack of motivation can lead us to conclude that they, like the Mafia, only assisted in the cleanup. This leaves only the CIA. They had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. The company could not forget Kennedy's refusal to support them during the Bay of Pigs fiasco. In addition, he was also considering pulling the US out of Vietnam and therefore putting a stop to the company's own little war. He also was a sympathizer to the civil rights struggle. However, what topped it all was the fact that he was determined to destroy the company and put an end to its deceptive tactics.
This is the BBC Home Service. It is with deep regret that we announce that President Kennedy is dead.
President Kennedy was shot in full view of the public during a routine electioneering motorcade in Dallas, Texas. 1 hour before the shooting, the entire Washington phone system was taken down. The motorcade route was suspiciously changed at the last minute to accommodate his passage through the open area of Dealey Plaza. The Secret Service conveniently neglected carrying out routine checks on windows overlooking the route. To the horror of those watching, the president was killed by shots to the upper body and then a final conclusive shot to the head. According to eyewitnesses and a home video made by Abraham Zapruder, these shots were not fired by a lone gunman. Afterwards, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested within hours of the shooting. Later, while still in police custody, Jack Ruby, a mob cleanup guy, shot Oswald dead. The initial public reaction was that Ruby was a patriotic American. However, these were the actions of a mob silencer. Although Oswald, a Marxist, appeared to be a supporter for Castro, he also maintained relationships with right-wing extremists and known CIA operatives. It had now become clear to the world that Oswald had taken the fall for the agency. It was General Charles Cabell who changed the motorcade route so that it made the slow, fatal turn past the Texas Book Depository, ultimately luring the president into the deadly crossfire. General Cabell had been assistant director of the CIA until Kennedy fired him after the Bay of Pigs showdown. Even George Bush Sr. was suspected of being involved in the assassination plot, as he was at the time deeply involved in the CIA and in the Bay of Pigs invasion plot. Lee Harvey Oswald had been employed by ex-FBI agent Guy Bannister, who was also supposed to be involved in the recouping of Cuban exiles for covert CIA missions into Cuba. By coincidence, on the day of the assassination, Richard Nixon also happened to be in Dallas, supposedly on business for Pepsi Cola. Close to 60 people who were either witnesses or connected with some phase of the operation would die under mysterious circumstances in the years and months following the assassination. It was now becoming apparent to the US and the rest of the world that the CIA were capable of anything.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
Bob Marley, born in 1945 in Kingston, Jamaica, revolutionized the world with his music. More than a music genius, he used his art form as a conduit for social awakening. He wrote uncompromising conscious songs for and about the disenfranchised people of the West Indian slums. He was an icon of honor and hope for those that had none. Bob Marley stood as a conscious figure in Jamaican politics when he united the hands of political rivals Michael Manley and Edward Seaga. However, his popularity with people extended across the seas, and he became a spokesman through his lyrics, crying out against oppression, slavery, injustice, and war. In 1980, for Zimbabwe's independence, President Mugabe enthusiastically invited Bob Marley to perform at the celebrations. He was greatly admired throughout the world for his message of African unity and civil justice. Songs like Africa Unite, War, So Much Trouble in the World, Jericho Walls, Redemption Song show the direction and power of his lyrics. It was no secret that Bob and his associates, being powerful revolutionaries, were closely monitored by the CIA. When Bob Marley was suddenly diagnosed as having melanoma cancer, a rare cancer for blacks, rumors of CIA involvement surfaced. In May 1981, the legend passed away, and the world was in shock. It was said that when in France for another ailment, he was given an overdose of radiation. Some blamed his cancer on his use of marijuana. However, melanoma cancer is not caused by marijuana usage. In death, his message lives through his music, scribed in the books of immortality. The agency did not always act alone. In the 1960s, the CIA and FBI were forced to work together for the first time. After the assassination of President Kennedy, fingers were being pointed at both agencies. The CIA's connection to Lee Harvey Oswald was being questioned. It was now necessary for both agencies to come together to ensure that the hasty explanation made by the Warren Commission stuck. By the arrival of the 1960s, the two organizations had achieved a good working relationship. While the FBI spied on radical groups, harassed peace organizations, and executed many of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, the CIA operatives opened mail, tapped phones, penetrated anti-war organizations, and set up campus fronts to pinpoint dangerous student agitators. Even though the FBI and CIA were now working somewhat in tandem, they still stuck to the firm belief that nothing illegal existed in the time of war.
I understand that people are suspicious of the CIA. Our activities are secret, and accordingly there is not a lot of public understanding of what we do. In the course of recruiting agents to penetrate drug cartels, to break up those groups that bring drugs to the United States, our case officers, our men and women, deal with bad people, very bad people.
The CIA had initially emerged as a small operation with limited jurisdiction. However, almost immediately, they would be allowed to operate according to their own laws and with very few restrictions. They were also given the power to undertake covert operations. The question now emerges of who really was in charge. By 1953, when Alan Dulles became director, the agency had already become its own governor. His brother ran the State Department. They had in fact become what was described as a de facto shadow government. They provided information about their actions only when they thought it was necessary. Directive NSC-4 empowered the agency to allow them greater elbow room in the international arena in the fight against communism. The truth was out there, but could not be entrusted to the American public or even the American president. All of their actions were therefore untouched by external influence and strictly controlled internally. Using money, propaganda and influence, the agency played a vital role in determining the outcome of elections in many of the European countries that were emerging from the devastation of World War II. They ensured the defeat of the communists in the 1948 Italian elections and the major victory of the Labour Party in Israel. Throughout its existence, the agency had survived 10 presidents. Truman became wary of them. Eisenhower went along with whatever they did. Kennedy was determined to tear them down brick by brick, while Lyndon, like Eisenhower, gave all their operations a rubber stamp. Richard Nixon used the agency for his own dirty tricks operations. After Nixon's resignation, the CIA would be in as much disarray as the country. President Jimmy Carter was to make the first move to ensure that the rules of the US were respected. In 1977, he appointed Admiral Stansfield Turner as director of the agency. They both wanted operatives to concentrate on high-tech information gathering and phase out all of their not-too-admirable operations. Unfortunately, when Ronald Reagan came into power, Turner would be replaced by William Casey, a veteran of the OSS. The agency could now return to dirty tricks, destabilization, and quasi-military covert ops. George Bush was the head of the CIA, and when he came to power, he was beyond the shadow of a doubt the CIA's man at the top. As a CIA top man, and as a president, he was rumored to be involved in some unspeakable covert operations, from involvement in the Kennedy assassination to Irangate. The link between the current President George W. Bush needs close attention. After all, he is his father's son. Throughout the CIA's brief history, we have seen the revelation behind many of their actions. Consequently, any statement made by the agency is routinely being questioned. This lends a certain measure of unwarranted credence to some of the most paranoid and far-fetched stories about its operations and objectives. For more than 50 years, the CIA was willing to remove any source they perceived as a threat to their survival. They effectively exhausted the excuse that communism was an overwhelming danger and that no action could be considered extreme in their fight to put an end to it. As far as they were concerned, the means always justified the end. With the Red Menace now only confined to Cuba, the company can no longer excuse its methodology for conducting business. Will it be possible to ever fully dismantle the CIA? According to the Hydra of Greek myth, you can cut the head off and 10 more will grow back in its place. The only way really to effectively close down the agency would be to revoke its character and cut off its money. But again, is this possible? For years the agency has received defense budgets, all without the authorization of Congress. The agency also receives an income from various ongoing investment enterprises that range from drug trafficking to the ownership of airlines and banks. The agency's ties to some of the world's most powerful organizations guarantees them a strong support system. The CIA could in fact stand alone as a vast autonomous entity, operating either for hire or as it did before, according to its own agenda. In the new century, the CIA is a forgotten menace. The new government, they say, has little need for their dirty tricks. There is no more communist threat. There is no enemy physically suitable for the CIA to attack. The power that they once exercised has very little sympathy in this new, bold era. All the old enemies have faded from the battlefield, and the CIA, like an old weapon, is rusting away. Or is it? The events of the 11th of September will mark the return of the Jackal and issue a brand new lease of life for the old company.
The search is underway for those who are behind.
The 200,000 Afghans have fled their homes during U.S. military strikes.
Intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible. and to bring them to justice. We will show the world that we
and they will follow that path all the way to where it ends, in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies.
September the 11th, 2001. The symbol of America's wealth, power and glory crumbles to the ground. America's indestructibility seems broken. A frustrated nation now looks for a physical target on which to exercise its vengeance. A human emotional reaction to a crisis. A message is needed. A military message to alleviate anger, and a political message to show the world America's resolve.
Congress gave him even more power than really almost any other declaration of war that I've ever seen.
However, in this new world of warfare, the enemy is vague. Vague enemies make for poor missile targets. How can America retaliate against this kind of enemy that lies dormant within their midst? And how can a sword be used on an operation that requires a scalpel? The world lays in fear at a new word, which comes to dominate daily conversation. Terror. And the emblem of this terror is Osama bin Laden and the country that houses him, Afghanistan. Without hesitation, bin Laden's guilty verdict precedes his trial as America marches its battle fleet to the distant seas. But this is a war that America will not handle alone. If blood is to be spilt in Afghanistan, it will be blood not only on America's hands. Wars always know sequels, and history is our greatest teacher. How do they start and how they end is no mystery, but always truth and the innocent are its biggest casualties. The world has always been made of a minority of poisonous personalities who are not exclusive to land, race, or religion. But every decade needs its heroes and villains, a black and white concept which justifies convenient wars. The unblurring line was drawn by President Bush, and under his vague rhetoric, he rallies a hypnotized world to strike collectively and indiscriminately at a naked evil. He has manipulated the world to join him on a roller coaster ride, while his loyal sidekick, Tony Blair, blindly jumps on for the ride without even asking the destination. In America's arrogance, it would not even lend a second to examine a much criticized foreign policy. Policies clearly at the root of the hostilities that besieged the city of New York. Power words and rhetoric dot the screen in an action drama more befitting the movie cinema. Politicians jockey for their spotlight, seeking new catchphrases, which the media pump to the masses. The enemy is over there, and when they are defeated, there will be peace on earth. Sincerity has been traded for flaunting of meaningless gestures, which will have no effect on the game except to rearrange the pieces and inflame the problem they claim they have come to extinguish. The war on terror is a war that has few clear enemies, and less clear aims.
First objective of a long campaign, and the first objective is to bring people to justice who we feel like committed this particular set of atrocities.
The Western political and media machines have placed halos over their leaders' heads and horns on the heads of their enemies. In the Western aim to combat this evil, they themselves have politically terrorized weaker nations to bow to their wishes. The free world is not giving them much freedom in its attempts to form a global coalition against terrorism. From promises to bribes to downright bullying, this coalition will be formed by any means necessary. Those who dare oppose or question stand to receive Afghanistan's fate. Stirring dark waters, America and her Western allies are causing a tide of conflict around the world in a completely irresponsible and callous way. The side effects of this war on terrorism are bringing countries such as Pakistan and Indonesia closer to civil war, as people tally between loyalty to their brothers and self-preservation. Pakistan's President Musharraf has traded his Muslim brothers for Western promises. The hand he is extending to the West will soon turn into a leg. He has failed to realize that when it comes to promises, America has a history of treachery. From the promises General Custer made the Native American Indians, to the promises made to the South Vietnamese, and more recently the promises made by former President Bush to the Iraqi people in return for their opposition to Saddam. After America gets what they want, all promises to the non-Western world will be off. America is powerful and has always stirred political opinion in a direction which is favorable to American dominance. The West has set a very broad net to catch one small fish. America has a blank check and wants all the nations of the world to sign it. With this blank check, America can act in any direction she deems suitable and necessary. Using his Texan cowboy words like dead or alive, Bush is appealing to a rogue mass, and for a so-called leader of a civilized country, he sets no moral precedent, shows no restraint, and turns away from intellectual console to resolve the problem. History has a knack for remembering presidents who are associated with wars, and it seems that every American president seeks a war to be remembered by. And George W. Bush is making sure he goes down in history as an American hero, a man who restored patriotism and exports the American dream. But the ink has not yet dried, as we fearfully wait to see what will be left for history to write.
With every atrocity, they hope that America grows fearful.
Congress gave him
retreating from the world,
even more power than really almost any other declaration of war that I've ever seen.
They stand against us because we stand in their way. We're not deceived by their pretenses to piety. We have seen their kind before. They are the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, they follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism.
This is a callous violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. It is a deliberate effort of a powerful atheistic government to subjugate an independent Islamic people.
December 1979. Russia, ignoring international condemnation, waged war on the Asian country of Afghanistan. The Russians were met by a surprisingly determined 250,000 strong unified Muslim army bent on purging this communist terror from their land. The tenacious Mujahideen, armed with Russian-made Kalashnikovs, became the freedom warriors glamorized by films such as Rambo 3. Their steadfast faith was their only asset. When Ronald Reagan succeeded Carter as president, he blessed the Mujahideen, calling them freedom fighters, and covertly backed this insurgents with billions of dollars of state-of-the-art military equipment. In their eyes, this was Russia's Vietnam. And like America almost a decade earlier, the Eurasian would eventually erode Russian morale. The CIA came into the picture and was responsible for training these Muslim warriors in the art of sabotage and other covert tactics. The international Western media sanctioned this war and reiterated its holy objectives. The Muslims opposed communism on religious grounds and the West on political grounds. In theory, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Osama bin Laden came to Afghanistan from a rich and prominent family in Saudi Arabia, where he was the 17th son of more than 50 siblings. With his money and powerful Saudi connections, he rallied financial support for the Afghan cause and became its greatest private financier. Being involved in his family's construction company gave him the necessary skills to build much-needed roads and hospitals in Afghanistan. Osama became a source of mystical inspiration for many. He was a man who sacrificed a life of luxury for a life of dedication to his Muslim brothers. In 1989, what was thought impossible became reality when Russia retreated, defeated, and humiliated from Afghanistan. 15,000 Russians and over 1 million Afghan warriors were lost in this 10-year holy war. December 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, America rejoiced as years of anti-communist rhetoric and Cold War tactics had triumphed. In America's eyes, democracy had prevailed as light outshines darkness. America, having what she really wanted, turned away from Afghanistan and all the promises she had made. Afghanistan was left in ruins. 2/3 of the population became refugees.
Once we had won the war, or once our
Afghans won the war with our help, we walked away. We walked away and we left it to Pakistan and we left it to Saudi Arabia to rebuild the area and to reestablish.
For Afghanistan, the success bred of devotion had paid off, and now the warriors sought to continue their success by fighting against oppression on a global scale. In Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir, Sudan, and Somalia, they had become the police of the Islamic world. However, a bitter soreness born from betrayal was brewing for America, their former allies. In 1991, a new war was waged against Saddam Hussein for his invasion of oil-rich Kuwait, a country with enormous American investment. Prior to this, America, via its dubious tentacles, namely the CIA, had aided Saddam's rise to power during the Iran-Iraq War. Saudi Arabia, bordering Kuwait, felt threatened by Saddam's army and turned to the USA, a non-Muslim power, for defense. In the eyes of the Muslim world, the leaders of Saudi Arabia had turned to a non-Islamic force for the defense of the cradle of Islam, a strange and unacceptable dilemma. To add insult to injury, after the war against Saddam was won, America decided to set up a permanent base in Saudi Arabia. In the eyes of Osama bin Laden and the majority of the conscious Muslim world, this act defaced Islam's sacred sites. For his blatant outspokenness against the restrictive Saudi monarchy, bin Laden was stripped of his citizenship and publicly disowned by his family. Enraged and infuriated, bin Laden declared unlimited war on all Americans, soldiers, and civilians. An act outside of the fold of Islam.
A few months ago, and again this week, bin Laden publicly vowed to wage a terrorist war against America, saying, and I quote, "We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. They're all targets. Their mission is murder, and their history is bloody."
In 1992, bin Laden found a new home in Sudan, a nation of Islamic people being ruled by an Islamic system of government. Bin Laden contributed significantly to this poor African country by building roads and hospitals. According to the CIA, bin Laden used Sudan as a cover for international terrorist training camps. In December 1992, American troops once again found themselves in another Muslim country, Somalia, with allegedly noble intentions. Once again, this was viewed by the Muslim world as an extension of American control, a base to monitor and suppress any Islamic uprising. When the World Trade Center was bombed in 1993, Sudan was caught in America's political backlash, as heavy sanctions were waged upon them, and they were branded with the dubious title, "A State that Sponsors Terrorism." In 1995, Sudan felt America's military fury when a pharmaceutical store was targeted and innocent people were killed. American intelligence reported that this store was a haven for terrorist activities. Sudan renounced these claims and opened the investigations, which were later internationally confirmed. The findings showed that the store was just that, a store, and nothing more. Not only did this show the unreliability of American intelligence information, but also its clear neglect for Muslim lives. In 1998, terror struck a double blow in Kenya and Tanzania almost simultaneously. American embassies were targeted by a truck bomb. What shocked the world was the majority of casualties were poor African Muslims. The terrorists were prepared to kill their own to further their cause. Those who perpetrated these horrendous acts have lost their humanity and have become like wild beasts with only one thought in mind, to devour their prey. These persons, so depraved, only want to bring death and destruction because of their hatred for the United States of America. Whenever any human being is deprived of justice, the mind becomes imbalanced. The greater the injustice, the greater the imbalance. In a balanced world, institutions are established for the redress of grievances, and with this facility of expression, rage and frustration can be quenched and abated. The terrorists did not target the beautiful island of Barbados or Switzerland. These are not random, meaningless acts. So why is America so hated?
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world.
Unfortunately, this self-indulgent nursery rhyme answer alone strips him of credibility as a leader in tune with the reality of the world outside of America. After the Gulf War, over 500,000 children died because of US sanctions. Innocent children, hidden from the eyes of the media and the tears of the outside world. Palestinians die daily at what they see as an oppressive and heavy-handed Israeli government, supported politically and financially by America. You have bin Laden, we have Sharon, they say. In this world, there is no shortage of hostility for America because of their actions, past and present. Any clear definition of what constitutes terrorism is being avoided, as America is afraid it may first have to turn its anti-terrorism guns on itself.
Coleman McCarthy is the director of the Center for Teaching Peace. He's a professor at Georgetown Law School and teaches at American University.
We have a history of bombing countries. In the past 20 years alone, we've bombed Libya, Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq, and before that, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Congo, Indonesia, Guatemala. We are, as Martin Luther King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. Until we disarm and de-escalate our war machine, we're going to be hated around the world.
Clearly, by any dictionary definition, America is an international terrorist, exporting intimidation and intrigue. It is interesting to note that the USA controls over 70% of the international market in weapons. The US peddles products of destruction to so-called undemocratic regimes and unstable regions across the planet. Of the 48 regional wars going on today, 39 involve US weapons, and since World War II, over 40 million people have died in these conflicts, largely women and children. In a recent CNN poll, would you accept more government involvement into your life if it meant greater security? 70% voted yes. Now the coalition governments have people so scared that they are willing to give up their personal freedom in exchange for totalitarianism. The CIA has failed the people it has sworn to represent. The CIA gladly takes the bullet for not being more prepared. They say with more funding diverted from schools and health, they will be better equipped to protect the nation. Now that the government recognizes the need for greater intelligence, the CIA will no doubt be dusted off and restored to its former seat of power, a seat that it has not sat on since the Cold War era.
The CIA and NSA have depended on Project Echelon, a multinational electronic snooping system with keyword retrieval.
Think of Echelon as an internet search engine. And if you're smart, you don't use a word like bomb and trade center and hijack and flight lessons. You don't use keywords that are going to tip people off. While they're up over there, they're just sucking up like a vacuum cleaner every single transmission. Cell phones, faxes, radios, telephone calls, HF, VHF, so on. And what happens is all that data is collected and then it's run through computers and then it has to get sifted down to where we have people who are fluent.
The Taliban regime before this incident received mixed feelings. Regardless of what is believed of the Taliban, they are clearly not the terrorists that inspired the World Trade Center bombing. They have been drawn into this conflict on a different rope because of their friendship and loyalty to an ex-soldier of the Afghan-Russian war. They have been singled out because they have no fear in a climate of fire. They have made honor their bond and have not knelt before an insurmountable opposition. They have no fear or respect for America, and thus pose a threat that must be killed before it is allowed to grow. The Taliban, prior to September the 11th, have practiced an isolationist policy which has not been to neither their nor their people's advantage. Politics is something alien to the Taliban rulers. Their no-tolerance policy and hardline tactics have choked practicality. Nonetheless, it is noticeable that in all of the smoke, they have stood cool-headed and asked one simple request: give us evidence.
And tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands on the Taliban. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your land.
The world that claims to be defending civilization seems to be the one that should take lessons from these so-called uncivilized militants. Bush claims no negotiation. Why?
These demands are not open to negotiation.
This stance adds credence to the accusations of the Taliban that his war has nothing to do with bin Laden, but is really a war to crush an Islamic government.
If Mr. George Bush is not providing evidence and he is just expressing words in order to pave the way for war and attack in Afghanistan, it means the attack is pre-planned. They have already terrorized the common people. Thousands of people are...
The Taliban have earned the respect of many young revolutionary thinkers throughout the world who see through the Western propaganda mask. Many who previously condemned their extreme Islamic ideology now have great reverence for their bold stance. The Taliban know that the only way Bush can win this war is if they surrender bin Laden and bow. In a climate of fire, they know they must stand firm.
I myself have always criticized the Taliban. I criticize them on their position on women, on the media, on so many things, on enclosing themselves in a cocoon, separating themselves from the world. But today I admire them because they stand to America and to Britain, and they say to them, it is God who changes kingdoms and powers, and not America and Britain.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Bush and his henchmen now have their witch hunt. They have set up the basic validation to take away freedom, the same freedom they profess to uphold. Layer by layer, they will peel away until the world is their extension. Now it is impossible to separate any non-American ideology from terrorist ideology. Any group calling for an Islamic government is seen as a terrorist group. This word is being bastardized, and it will be used to drive fear into a jittery Western people. All that stands outside of democracy and Western values will be painted with this brush.
Their leaders are self-appointed. They want to overthrow existing governments in many Muslim countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. They want to drive Israel out of the Middle East.
So, is it really about terrorism, or is the agenda wider? Although Blair and Bush have reassured the world that it is not a war against the Muslim people, and that terrorism and Islam are not the same, it is strange that all the countries being targeted are Muslim countries, with absolutely no exception.
Almost all the nations we've bombed in the last 20 years are mostly people of color. An interesting fact. That's U.S. foreign policy. Go bomb and kill people with dark-colored skin.
Little mention of plans to attack Ireland have been proposed. No plans to bomb Irish camps harboring and training Sinn Féin terrorists. Gerry Adams' face is not on any dead or alive poster. It is also interesting to note that when Sinn Féin terrorist acts occur, the media label them as just Sinn Féin terrorist acts, never as extremist Catholic Christian fanatics. Nor was professed Christian Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, as extremist Catholic Christian fanatics. Nor was professed Christian Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, paraded as a Christian extremist.
Well, it depends what you mean by terrorist. If you mean any resistance fighter is a terrorist if the Europeans don't like him. They would call him a resistance fighter if they like him. They would call him even revolutionary if he takes our power. But if they don't like him, they just call him a terrorist.
One of the deeper agendas for the West is one of contagion. Since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim world has been fragmented into bickering groups. The only thing that can unite the world's largest practicing religion is an Islamic government. The Islamic government's sentiment in the South Asian region since the emergence of the Taliban has been on the increase. British Pakistani Muslims recently called for Pakistan to adopt a similar pan-Islamic government. Afghanistan has started a tradition that has to be nipped in the bud. In no way, shape or form can the Islamic sentiment be allowed to spread to Pakistan. It is interesting to note that Pakistan, unlike any other Muslim majority nations, is the only one to have nuclear capabilities. So it seems the bigger agenda is, as the Taliban say, beyond bin Laden, with the key objectives being 1. To form a US-friendly and dependent government in Afghanistan. 2. To further control resources of the Gulf and Caspian Seas. 3. To monitor Pakistan's nuclear bases and calm Israeli fears. And to kill the seeds of Islamic rule before they are allowed to grow. We need to question the motives behind some of the countries of the world lending their support to America. Russia, a country once embarrassingly defeated by the Mujahideen. Afghanistan's Northern Alliance, a rogue group of rapists and pirates backed into a 5% pocket of the region, desperately looking for any advantage to defeat the Taliban. China has now jumped on the American bandwagon by equating terrorism to the Islamic separatist movement in the Yingzha province, a people simply seeking a separate autonomy from mainland Chinese rule. Some of the bandits that make up the coalition defy ethical consideration. The American government, like the CIA, has transcended beyond morals and ethics to achieve a desired end. America has signed a Faustian pact, whose consequences will become apparent in the years to come. When this witch hunt ends, America and her allies will have all of its enemies dispatched and neutralized. And so, with one word, terrorism, the 21st century witch hunt has begun.
Peace advocates are applauding the president's speech, but only with one hand.
The UN 2 days in their warning that 1 million Afghans face imminent starvation and staff cannot return to the country to support food supplies.
Along with Attorney General John Ashcroft's call for roving wiretaps, means that many American citizens could soon be more listened to than Osama bin Laden.
Being an unstable leader, he might go off on a tangent, and the US could possibly use excessive aggression in response to the attack, leading to a humanitarian crisis.
Prior to September the 11th, the media via the Hollywood Institute had begun a mental marination process with films such as The Siege and the more dangerous film Rules of Engagement. The aim of the media is to marry Islam to terrorism in a slow ceremony. Misuse of words like Islamicist and Muslim fundamentalist, which are generally benign in nature, are being reverted, hijacked, and associated with the extreme action of a negligible few. The media generally parades two types of Muslims on their screens: the extreme impractical groups with un-Islamic agendas, fueled and engulfed by hate and frustration, and the second group of old, weak, pacified, disillusioned, out-of-touch reactionary and apologetics. They are a sharp misrepresentation of the contemporary intellectual Muslim world. These assimilated and confused people, as opposed to stand up for justice, strip themselves of their honor and beg like dogs for crimes they have not committed. In a malicious attempt to demonize Muslims, footage of Palestinians celebrating in the aftermath of the attack were pumped around the world. This now became the focal point that enraged the world against the Muslim community. The media has used its powerful arm again to control and reroute sympathy. Whatever little sympathy the Palestinian people were receiving from their resistance to the Israeli occupation was now quickly withdrawn. Clearly, these repeating images were circulated with that predominant objective in mind. Rumors emerged later that the footage, several years old, and the celebrations were with regards to Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait. A more accurate report investigated and found that people celebrating had no knowledge that America had been attacked. This information was conveniently ignored by the major media companies. Once again, the Muslim world was faced with defending itself against crimes it had not committed. In the minds of the unvoiced and oppressed, the tragedy that befell America is a tragedy that has become normal to them. In their minds, America knows how they feel, now that she too has tasted death.
We want something to cause America to wake up. But as soon as we woke up ourselves from the shock, we realize that the victims were innocent people. And that no act of humiliation is moral in response to this.
The error of some elements in the Muslim world is in their laid-back approach prior to these chain of events. Two groups exist: those who have become content to remove their identity and merge into the society, a group that now lies exposed and homeless, desperately turning back to their Islamic identity for shelter. And the second group, the isolationist, who has left a niche of educating the non-Muslim world to the non-Muslim world. This selfish exclusion has now brought great misunderstanding, and from misunderstanding, the Muslims living in the West have now found themselves surrounded by people who fear them. The previous narrow generalizations of stereotyping and alienating the West have been to no benefit. What many have failed to recognize is that America is a massive nation made up of many ethnic minorities and cultures. It is a nation with a broad range of views, and has brought forth some of the most revolutionary thinkers such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Within this wide variety of people, there are hearts and minds begging to learn about Islam, but they are left wanting. The media has been pumping out anti-Islamic material for decades, and now that things have come to a head, the newly stimulated Muslim groups have risen from their slumber to fight a media battle that is in its maturity. When Hitler came to power, he slowly called for one item after another, until finally his true agenda was revealed. He did not on one sunny day come straight out and profess that all Jews were the enemies of Germany. This sympathy was built up in stages until a frenzy of emotion was created, so unbridled that whatever Hitler declared was acceptable. No one dared challenge him. No one dared question if it was right or wrong. For those who forget history, they are doomed to repeat it. The past, future, and present are invariably linked in a cyclic dance. Nations do not come to power by acts of generosity, nor do they stay there with compassion and sincerity. The jewel of freedom is protected by an army of thieves. Let us not be fooled by the charity arm that they have extended to the Afghan people. Charity has a double edge. It maintains a good public image, and it acts to control people. Starving people make poor soldiers, and they will never bite the hand that feeds them. Freedom for the West means the descent of the Third World. The lifestyles enjoyed in the West are all possible because of a complete world system that keeps certain nations and their people in check. Slavery and such systems enforced by the West on the so-called Third World built up their empires and feed a society bent on maintaining a standard of living by continuous taxation and exploitation. These are the unconfessed secrets of the superpowers of the world. It is a savage, parasitic reality. The US tragedy brought home a concept alien to the American people. The reality of the suffering of the rest of the world for a long time has been far removed from American lives. This pain has ultimately overflown, and tragedy has shown itself to be an indiscriminate beast. A war has begun, and already the first victims are truth and innocence. Their arrogance is the seed of destruction. All they claim they have come to defend is what they will strip from the world. Security and sanctity will be violated as the enemies of the Western dominance become ever more incognito. All of our tears fall to a thirsty earth that has seen centuries of oppression of man by the hand of man. We turn to the one true God and pray that he makes their evil intentions like dust in the wind.
This is a president, like the president before him and the one before him, who believes in killing people to solve our international disputes.
The European definition now isn't necessarily the definition.
That in a world of an eye for an eye, the whole world will become blind.
Satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
And a closer look at the CIA. Powers